This is my personal gaming system running Stalker 2 at 1440p high settings, and as you can tell, it's not going very well. And it's not like I'm being greedy here. I've got balanced DLSS going, and in this town with a bunch of NPCs around, it still runs like it wasn't vaccinated against TB, which I guess would be fine if the utilization made sense and the game didn't look like it's been through several digestive tracts. But it's not just Stalker 2. The engine that it's built in, Unreal Engine 5, has built up a bit of a reputation for producing terrible looking and running games. So in today's video, I'm gonna try and figure out what this and other Unreal Engine 5 games want from me. But first, today's video is sponsored by Be Quiet's fancy light loop AIOs. Ooh. Whoa. Don't worry, it's still fine. The packaging held up good. The light loop AIOs are serviceable, easy to install, don't have any proprietary connectors on them, and did I mention they look real snazzy. They're also available in 360mm radiator sizes if you need some real cooling power. So check out the beautiful light loop AIOs using the link down below. Thank you Be Quiet for sponsoring today's video. Now, of course, we need a bit of context for that gameplay in the intro, because I could very well have been running it on the respirator which I stole from that lovely old lady in my building, but that wasn't the case at all. My personal system's pretty powerful. I've got an RTX 4070 in there with a Ryzen 7 5700. Now I know that it's just an 8-core AM4 CPU, but it has to be good for more than like 50 frames per second. And then in terms of RAM, I've got 32 gigs of DDR4 running at 3200 MHz. This is a system that should run the crap out of most modern games, but that's very much not what's happening. So with that, let's see if tweaking the settings can help us out much. Now my instinct's telling me that we've got a CPU bottleneck here, partly because of what the GPU's doing, but that's still very annoying. I feel like the 5700 should be capable of more than 50 frames per second. Now another thing that makes me think that this is a CPU bottleneck is because when I go into settings, graphics, and DLSS, you can see it's running at balanced, crazy. But let's drop this to performance. It's made no difference to the frame rate. So we're rendering at a much lower resolution, but the frame rate is the same. The thing is though, it's still really weird because I've just got 48% CPU utilization, which isn't very high. And even when you bring up all of the individual cores, there's no crazy utilization going on any of these cores aside from CPU 8, maybe? And in garbage, when I set overall graphics to medium settings, it also didn't help much, although it needs to restart the game. 1 second. Oh, okay, well, there are suddenly a huge amount of stalkers in this room which weren't here before, so let's just wait for them to leave, because I think that impacts the frame rate. That guy's stuck on a doorway, very good.
5 minutes later.
Yeah, now there's 3 of them stuck in the doorway, very good. So with all of those guys gone, the frame rate has climbed a little bit. We've gone from about 51 to 56. The game does look a decent bit worse though at medium, especially when it comes to textures and stuff. It's a lot less detailed. This is how I've been playing it. I've been playing it at medium because it makes the town bits more or less bearable. You know, one of the differences is that it doesn't dip as aggressively. So with high settings, walking around, which medium really does look worse. But with high settings, it dips into the 40s pretty regularly here, and it makes it super frustrating going to the different vendors and whatever. At which point I changed a whole bunch of individual settings, but again, none of them made a significant difference to the frame rate. We were still hovering in the 50s in this area. Okay, so we've established that in built-up areas, regardless of the settings, we have a very small range of frame rate. Out in the wilderness, the performance is way better, but I'm focusing on the towny areas because it's like worst case scenario, right? Now on a quick side note, I'm pretty late to this party. I know people have been ragging on Stalker 2 performance for ages, but I've been curious to see what various updates will do to the performance, because you know that developers make games after they've launched now. And to give credit to the team behind Stalker, there have been a bunch of huge updates since the game has launched, but none of them have made that much of a difference to the performance. I mean, what we're seeing here today is on the latest patch, so it's clearly not helped much. But anyway, with that, it's time for me to act on my hunch. Upgrade the CPU and see what it does. Now my basic strategy here is to just tear open Stalker 2's gluttonous mouth and force feed it 3D Vcache until it vomits up frame rate foie gras. And I think the best way to do this is to jump up to the fastest CPU I have available, the 7950X3D. Okay, so there is a 7950X3D in this system now. Stalker does not have the right to cry anymore, although there is something else it could cry about. The RAM is only running at 4800 megahertz. I haven't enabled XMPs yet because I'm curious to see if we get more frame rate pushing our RAM speed higher. And then maybe after that, I'll also drop in faster RAM and see if the Ryzen CPU explodes because of it or not. But yeah, let's launch Stalker and see what happens. Whoa, look at how fast them shaders are compiling. Look at that. Whoa, that's a huge jump. It's gone from about 50 to almost 80 frames per second. And now we're using a lot more of our GPU. That utilization's jumped up to about 90%. I am curious though what happens when we turn up the RAM speed as well. Wow, an extra 5 frames per second is not too shabby. And look at that 1% low uplift. That's way better. So with the 7950X3D and our RAM running at 6000 megahertz, we're finally getting to a point in the town bit with a bunch of NPCs and whatever, where we're properly utilizing our 4070. Next, I wanted to try some 7200 megahertz RAM, but the system was having none of it. The initial Gigabyte motherboard I tried was so offended by the request that it just didn't post again, even when I put the original RAM back into it. It was only on the third motherboard, an NZXT B650E board, that would actually launch and boot with 7200 MHz RAM, and after all of that effort, the result was less than spectacular. We actually lost some frame rate, but I think this is run-to-run variance. Okay, so we've solved it. All you need to do to use the entirety of your 4070 at 1440p in Stalker 2 is drop a $750 CPU into your system. Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I'm sure the optimization equivalent of the Balkans War doesn't alienate 99% of the PC gamers that don't have 3D V-cache. Now, out of curiosity, I also dropped in an AMD RX 7800 XT, which according to TechSpot, on average at 1440p is a bit faster than a 4070. And that kinda tracks for Stalker 2. At 1440p high settings, the frame rate was very similar. So at least the game doesn't discriminate in that way. But if you want to see how a huge variety of graphics cards perform in this game, go check out the Hardware Unboxed video I'll have linked down below. Anyway, back to my configuration. And with our new Oil Baron CPU, stepping up from poo-poo garbage medium settings to high costs us a bit of frame rate, but the game looks a lot better and still feels very playable even in garbage with all of these AI around. So one thing that I do want to see is if we can use less aggressive DLSS. Because here, I am actually using DLSS 4, so I have updated to the tensor mode DLSS, and it looks better, but it's still pretty smeary and has that signature UE5 Vaseline in the eyeballs look to it. Now, weirdly enough, stepping from balanced DLSS back up to quality had a very small performance penalty. Which I guess makes sense considering the render scale doesn't change much between the two settings, and 66 for quality feels very aggressive. But anyway, it also means that when I went to DLAA, which is like using DLSS at the native resolution, but then it just functions as anti-aliasing, here we lost a lot of frame rate because of the huge jump in render scale. Now with DLAA, the objects close to me were significantly sharper than before, but all the trees and foliage in the distance were still pretty Vaseline-y, which is a pretty big problem because there's just so much foliage in this game. Now, YouTube compression is going to make this very difficult for me to illustrate in this video, but if you've played the game, you'll know what I'm talking about. But this did get me thinking. Here, we're running the game natively at 1440p, so surely I can just turn off DLAA and then the game would look great. Well, no, because when I did that, this happened. Ugh, look at that grass. Why does the game look worse without any upscaling on it? And like here, stuff's sharp now, right? Like the truck. Look at that, that's sharp now. But then there's all of this weird visual artifact on things like grass. Now, I'm no game developer, but the game clearly has some issue with foliage. It kind of looks like the game is using upscaling as a denoiser. It just smears Vaseline over the noise and then there you go. Problem solved. Which would kind of explain why the foliage congeals into this gray mass. So clearly, the visuals and performance of Stalker 2 are a complete mess. Now, is that because, well, it's a Stalker game and that very much just comes with the territory, or is it Unreal Engine 5's fault? Now, to determine if it's UE5's fault, I'm going to try a couple other games built in the engine and see if they exhibit the same symptoms of UE5ness. What are these symptoms? Well, I'm going to hand it over to Army Dawid to break it down. At ease, maggots. Today's briefing is about some intel on an engine ravaging the games industry. Unreal Engine 5. Settle down. I know it's terrifying, but to beat your enemy, you must know how to identify your enemy. Luckily, Unreal Engine 5 has 4 clear indicators. Number 1, terrible performance. If a high-end gaming system struggles to maintain 45 frames per second at 1080p, I've got bad news for you. You may be playing an Unreal Engine 5 game. Number 2, smearing. If your game looks like MRE diarrhea, UE5. Number 3, what's with these leaves? Why are they in every game? They just phase in and out of existence and bring attention to the smearing. I don't understand it. And finally, number 4, when you launch the game, it spends half an hour compiling shaders every goddamn time. So now that we know how to identify Unreal Engine 5, we need to see if every UE5 game looks as terrible as this one. With Silent Hill 2 running at 1440p high settings, first things first, our utilization makes a lot more sense. And this is with the Ryzen 7 5700. And jumping from the 5700 to the 7950 X3D with super fast RAM didn't really impact the frame rate much. Yeah, that's a very specific stalkerism. And 92 frames per second is pretty good. It makes sense. It's a 4070, it's a powerful graphics card. However, this is without ray tracing. Turning that on kicks your performance in the crotch, although the game does look a lot better with it on. They clearly made the game with that in mind because the lighting looks a lot less flat and more atmospheric, which you very much want in a game like Silent Hill 2. Now, in terms of smearing, it's way more controlled than Stalker 2, but even a 2-year-old that got into your laxative cabinet controls smearing better than Stalker 2. But other than that, there still is some visual weirdness. The reflections in the puddles still have a distinct UE5 low-resness to them, and the shadows and grass and stuff looks terrible without ray tracing on. Oh, and did I mention the trees have the same way of congealing into a big mass like they do in Stalker. However, when you turn scaling off, the foliage doesn't explode in the same way that it does in Stalker. Oh, and did I mention the wind leaves are here in full force? Then I also enabled DLSS 4 in the drivers, which really improves sharpness. It is way better than DLSS 3, but even with it on, the leaves still smear. An interesting side note, the game is very stuttery on laptop hardware. This mobile 4070 gives good frame rates, but yeah, there's some weird stuttering going on here. Generally, I'd say Silent Hill 2 looks and runs way better than Stalker 2, but it does still very much have the telltale UE5-ness to it. Oh, and did I mention the compiling? Yeah, definitely does that. I then decided to try and find a UE5 game that was generally considered as pretty well optimized, and a lot of people kept mentioning Satisfactory. And when the game defaulted the settings to Ultra at 1440p with balanced DLSS, which in this game only loses you 25% render scale, I was intrigued. And then I was double intrigued when there wasn't any smearing on the trees. I mean, just generally, visually, I like the style of this game a lot more than the other two, because it doesn't have that weird, terrible photorealisticness to it. Now, I'd say I'm not really equipped to review the performance of this game, because as you get further into it, you build huge factories with a bunch of conveyor belts and math and stuff happening, and I'm not smart enough to do any of that. But with a fresh account, I'd say this game doesn't immediately shout, "I'm a UE5 abomination" at you, even if it does have the leaves. Although, wild plot twist, it isn't a chronic compiler. But I think what looking at the other two games has put into perspective is that Unreal Engine 5 is a toolbox, a very advanced toolbox at that, and it feels a bit weird blaming the toolbox for the shoddy products made with it. Now, I'm not a game developer, maybe Unreal Engine 5 really is a nightmare to work with, but it's pretty new and people are clearly getting better at using it. Or at least there are people that are better at using it than others. And if the team behind Satisfactory is anything to go by, even smaller developers can use it to make really good looking games. Or if the team behind Stalker is to go by, small developers can use it to make really terrible looking and running games. I guess it's a bit of a toss-up. So with that, now that I've taken out a mortgage on my CPU, I'm gonna go and play some more Stalker. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe to the channel to more videos like this one. Until the next video, bye bye.